Hi, I'm Katie Taylor. I'm an amateur boxer and I live in Bray, County Wicklow in Ireland.
This is amateur boxing in Ireland in the 21st century. Not that there's anything particularly amateur about it anymore. The leading fighters are among the highest paid sports people in the land. They're part of sophisticated scientific training programs for mind and body. They even get flown to Los Angeles for television commercials.
We ain't done yet, man. We ain't done yet, man.
Yeah, simple.
It's Ireland's most successful international sport by far, with the boxers winning more Olympic medals than every other sport put together. But underneath this high-tech golden veneer lies a remarkable sporting tale. That there is an Irish Amateur Boxing Association at all is some feat. That it celebrates its centenary replete with a national stadium and a thriving network of clubs from 32 counties representing communities from all sides of social and sectarian divides elevates the history of the IABA into something of a sporting epic.
Now, we are boxing, remember, not professional boxing. It's a different sport completely. I'm not very fond of professional boxing because I think it's too vicious, completely too vicious. Amateur boxing is not. It's the art of self-defense. If you read a book, that's what it tells you. The art of self-defense.
It's much truer and real than professional boxing in many ways. There's a humanity and a dignity and there's a courage involved in it that's just so pure.
The gentlemen of Victorian England believed that professional boxing was a sport for the depraved and stained by gambling. So they invented their own code. Amateur boxing was conceived as a gentleman's sport, a bit like fencing, in which winning depended on skill and craft, as opposed to the professional game that largely relied on the ability of one man to batter another senseless. And by taking away any possibility of getting paid to fight, it also placed the sport outside the reach of the working class.
Everybody talks about professionalism and the professionalisation of sport, but of course the truth of it is that people have always been paid for playing sport. There is nothing new about this concept. What is new is the idea of amateurism, and amateurism is something which came out of the ethos of Victorian England, and the idea that to love sport was enough. You didn't need to get paid for it because if you were a middle-class professional or someone from the upper classes, you wanted to maintain control of your sport and you did not want to share it with working-class people, so you tried to exclude them.
Amateur boxing thrived in the British Armed Forces and police forces, and also in the great public schools of England. And this is how amateur boxing came to Ireland, through the British Army, the Royal Irish Constabulary, and Trinity College. Amateur tournaments were staged principally in and around Dublin, and in 1911, at a meeting in Beggars Bush Barracks, the Irish Amateur Boxing Association was formed. The outbreak of World War I, then the Easter Rising of 1916, and the War of Independence that followed effectively put an end to a sport which was dominated by the armed forces.
Sport was certainly not a major priority in those days. It was, settling into the new state and establishing the new administrative structures. Matters were very, very volatile at that time. I mean, the treaty wasn't followed by peace, it was followed by a civil war. So politics dominated the agenda.
When the fighting was finally over and the Free State was established, boxing became extremely popular in the new National Army. Even though the sport had been invented by English gentlemen and brought to Ireland by the despised British military, amateur boxing escaped the foreign games ban.
What they mean by foreign sports is English sports, but not all English sports, just English sports that are maybe identified with, say, the upper class, like cricket, or English sports that are identified with the British military, like, say, soccer. So it's very selective. But boxing isn't one of those, and I think it's because the values of boxing sort of transcend that kind of narrow sense of being associated with the upper British class or with the British military. And boxing is one of the things like swimming, for example, or athletics generally, which is just seen as international rather than just English in that pejorative sense.
Boxing's journey from the British garrisons into the heart of Irish sporting culture was completed when the sport was featured as part of the Tulchan Games in 1924. Reviving these games, essentially a Celtic Olympics, had been mooted by Michael Cusack and Maurice Davin when they founded the GAA.
When you look back on it, the Tulchan Games were quite an extraordinary spectacle. You think of it, it was 1924. The Civil War is barely a year finished. The Free State is barely 2 years in existence. And the Irish Free State in that year organised a festival which was larger than that year's Olympic Games.
The Tulchan Games were to be an exhibition of the best in Irish sports, a celebration of the new Free State. It was decided that the competitions would be open to all people of Irish birth and also all people whose parents or grandparents were Irish.
Boxing fitted quite nicely into that spectacle because, of course, it allowed the organisers of those games to include in the programme not just the very best Irish boxers, but it also enticed over various people who had taken part in the boxing at the Paris Olympics of 1924. Notably Purdy, for example, a New Zealander who won the welterweight title in the Tulchan Games. He actually beat an Irish representative, Sergeant Patrick Dwyer, who finished fourth in that year's Olympic Games. There was actually extraordinary footage of Purdy throwing shapes out in the air, showing you his moves, and the newspaper reports from that time talk of Purdy's extraordinary, extravagant style overpowering Dwyer, and how his sheer movement was too much for Dwyer.
In October 1926, boxing even became part of the reconciliation process with the old enemy. Less than 5 years after it had vacated the barracks, the British Army was back, ready to take on the Free State Army in gloved combat in Dublin. Boxing brought Irish and British soldiers into friendly conflict for the first time. One of the strongest advocates of boxing within the military was General Owen O'Duffy, who reapplied his enthusiasm to the Garda Síochána when he transferred from the army. O'Duffy had been a leader in the War of Independence and a protege of Michael Collins. He commanded the Irish police and defence forces before emerging as Ireland's leading fascist in the 1930s.
He is a very egotistical kind of character, and there is this sense that he kind of shapes the police force to reflect how he sees himself and how he sees the Irish Revolution. So it's very Gaelic, it's Catholic, and it's Republican. So when these boxing teams went off to France or went up to Belfast and had great results, you would read then later in the Garda journal how their greatness reflected on the greatness of the Commissioner and how it was a testament to O'Duffy's brilliance. So, I mean, you can be a bit cynical about that, of course, but it is true that the Gardaí and the Gardaí boxing teams and so on reflected very well on what the Irish state was doing. So this is part of a really kind of exciting period of state building in the 1920s and 1930s, and it's very successful PR, not just for O'Duffy and the Guards, but for the government generally.
Ireland's new military and police forces helped the sport emerge from the garrison to become the working man's sport.
At that time, all the lightweight divisions for the army and all the heavy weights, say from light middle up along, were generally Garda. And at that time, the Commissioner of the Garda had the idea of getting boxing clubs going in the different towns. So he would send out some of the people that were on maybe the international boxing squad, and that did develop boxing in the entire country to a degree.
O'Duffy saw local boxing clubs as a way of easing the Guards into communities where, as outsiders, they were often regarded with suspicion.
When O'Duffy was setting up the police force, the context was very important because it was in the middle of a civil war, and also the Garda Síochána was an unarmed force. So you're sending these young men into quite disturbed parts of the country where they were facing the threat of the armed IRA, and also they weren't known. Public support is really crucial. You know, they had to win acceptance. And when they came into these areas, they could make contact with the community through setting up sports clubs and GA teams and hurling teams and so on, building handball courts at the back of police stations. They were able to sort of make a contact with the local community.
The election of O'Duffy's deputy, Major General W.R.E. Murphy, to the presidency of the IABA in 1928 was a key moment in the organisation's history. Under his charge, provincial councils were established and the first national juvenile championships were staged, which resulted in thousands of boys flocking to boxing clubs around the country. Within a few years, there were more than 100 clubs affiliated to the IABA, with some 3,500 boxers donning the gloves.
I was born in the North City in Dublin, in a place called Denmark Street. All around that area there was a few publicans who were interested in helping kids who were in the areas to join boxing clubs to get them off the streets, see. It really, like, it was an ideal outlet for the tenements. There were hard times in it and you didn't get any money out of the boxing or anything else, but you got the protection from the evil deeds, could you say, of somebody else, you know. They were never your evil deeds, they were all the evil deeds of somebody else. By the time I was just 11-year-old, I had my first contest against Jimmy England. And I needn't tell you I lost. I just have a look at me. But most of the champions came out of the tenement areas. You'd have about 7 or 8 champions, like, in a small pocket, like, you know.
The IABA staged many international bouts during the 1920s. An Ireland team travelled abroad for the first time in 1926 to fight the Germans, who became regular visitors to Dublin in subsequent times. Indeed, the first German boxing team to fight under the banner of the Third Reich in 1933 arrived in Dublin just a few months after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Visiting teams rarely came away from Ireland with a victory, and by the early 1930s, the leading lights of the national team were among the most popular sportsmen of their day. One of the undoubted stars of the time was Frankie Kerr from Belfast.
He was the youngest man ever to win a senior title, in that he was only 16 when he won the title in 1932, and he actually won the trials to go to the Olympic Games in 1932, but somebody decided he was too young to go to the Olympic Games. He had a job in Belfast. He worked in Dunlop's. He made sports equipment. He was involved in making tennis rackets and footballs. He came to Dublin through Father McLaughlin, who was highly involved in Arbor Hill Boxing Club, and he got a job in Dublin, also in Dunlop's. His ability to fix tennis rackets was quite legendary. It was also a lucrative trade for him when times were difficult.
Frankie Kerr won his 6 national titles in the 30s, when times were certainly difficult. But those who controlled boxing in Ireland were nothing if not ambitious. When no other boxing association in the world owned its own stadium, and no other would have taken on the task of raising £13,000 without state help, the IABA built its own home, its own Croke Park.
Prior to that, they used to hold the national senior championships in the army barracks, or the police headquarters in the Phoenix Park. So they decided that, look, we're not going to have this a nomadic existence going around all the different places. Let's build a stadium.
The National Stadium was built adjacent to Griffith Barracks. There was an old, disused building on the site known as the Gun Room, which was converted into a gym. The foundation stone was laid in the summer of 1938, and by the following spring, the National Stadium was finished.
This was the first and still the only purpose-built boxing stadium in the whole world. It was finished in 1939 to allow the European Boxing Championships, which after the Olympics were the #1 boxing show on earth, because at that time there were no World Championships. It was the Olympics and that was it. And the Europeans were going, but they were never in Ireland. And in 1939 they were held right in this space. So it's remarkable. And on those first European Championships there were wins for 2 Irishmen, so that made it especially good. Jimmy Ingle and Paddy Dowdall got gold medals.
It seemed fitting that the first gold medal to be presented at the new stadium was to one of Dublin's own, 17-year-old Jimmy Ingle of Ringsend. And just a few hours after Ingle's win, Paddy Dowdall, another Dubliner, took the featherweight gold. Private Paddy Dowdall was an army man who was clearly well looked after by the butcher at Griffith Barracks, next door to the stadium.
He'd put a stake inside of his blinking thing here. And if he met Dowdall outside saying, having a pint or something, slip it to him. And it'd be the best of steak. It'd be sore lying and God knows what not. That had the control of the lot there.
And while the steak was being smuggled out of the barracks, similar means were used to get Paddy Kilty into the stadium on the opening night.
Someone said, would you like to go to the stadium with your dad, Paddy? Of course I said yeah. But then things went after that I didn't come into. I know that they flanked me in. I was smuggled in. That's the way I describe it. I was smuggled in. Paddy Dowdall got me in. Probably he was involved in the smuggling, but anyway. It was exciting, all right. Lights everywhere, you know. Boxers, they might as well have been foreign boxers for all I knew about them. But it was an enjoyable night.
The Germans respect nothing. Latest evidence of this is their bombing of neutral area.
Just as the National Stadium opened its doors, the world went to war, and international competition ceased for the next 5 years.
Maybe this is the price ERA has to pay for sitting on the fence.
But when the guns fell silent and some semblance of normality returned to people's lives, amateur boxing in Ireland embarked on a period of unprecedented popularity. And in cities like Belfast and Dublin, it became the working man's sport.
Dublin was very alive with boxing clubs. There's a lot of clubs around Dublin area, you know, and the north side of the city as well. You know, there was always plenty of action in Dublin for the scrapping. You know, great.
There were a plethora of clubs in the centre of the city. They occupied the basements of tenement houses, Gardner Street, York Street. But then, with the rapid expansion of the satellite towns at that time, Crumlin was one of the first. And Crumlin had a population of about 40 to 50,000 people. And there were very, very limited entertainment. So therefore, boxing clubs started up all over Crumlin. I remember coming to the stadium here one time and there was 8 weights on. There were 7 boxers from Crumlin. So that gives you an idea of how attractive that boxing was to people in Crumlin and Ballyfermot, Finglas, all these satellite towns, because they didn't have enough money. There was no work. So sons had to go out and box.
You have to remember too, the amateur boxing name, it wasn't, there was, if you got a club tournament, say with two big names fighting each other, you could nearly guarantee that there was money in it for them. I remember Jimmy Ingle, who was European flyweight champion in 1939. In his last amateur fight, he boxed one of his great rivals, Spike McCormick. And Ingle got 10 pounds. And he thought, God, I did well here. And later he realised that McCormick, who lost the fight, got 3 times that much. But this is amateur boxing. I think the authorities just turned a blind eye to it. We're happy to see the crowds come along.
People who boxed in the National Stadium, or anywhere else for that matter, got vouchers. You know, the vouchers could be for £2 to £3 at that time. So people would box probably every week in the stadium. They used to box every week. And they'd amass maybe 7 or 8 of these vouchers and then give them to their mother or father, who would then buy clothes, whatever. But that's what happened.
It was from the newly built streets of Crumlin that one of the real legends of Irish boxing emerged. Ollie Byrne started boxing as a schoolboy in the late 30s. And he was still donning the gloves in the 1970s after a ring career that lasted nearly 40 years.
Ollie Byrne was going out. He had about 5 or 6 brothers and sisters. And he just went out and he boxed every week to put bread on the table. That was it. It wasn't for the love of boxing. He just had to do that. Then he grew to love the boxing, there was no question about it.
He had his first fights in 1939, and his last fight, which I was at, was 1975. So that's 36 years in amateur boxing. I'm sure it must be a world record. I certainly haven't come across anybody who could equal it.
This is Ollie Byrne,